The restaurant sat on a quiet corner of the old quarter, the kind of place where candlelight flickered against dark wood and the scent of garlic and rosemary drifted from the kitchen like a memory. Outside, a black car eased to the curb, its engine low and expensive, and 4 men stepped out into the evening air with the unhurried confidence of men who had never once been told to wait. At the center of them walked Lorenzo Ferrara. 60 years old, silver threading through his dark hair, his tailored coat moving with him like a second skin. He was the kind of man whose presence changed the temperature of a room before he had said a single word. Men who owed him favors straightened their backs when he passed. Men who owed him nothing still lowered their voices. And yet, beneath the composed elegance, beneath 30 years of empire and reputation, there lived a stillness in him that no amount of power had ever managed to touch. A grief he had learned to wear so well that even he sometimes forgot it was there. Inside, moving between the tables with the practiced grace of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of being unnoticed, was a woman named Cecilia Russo. Early 50s, dark eyes that had seen more sorrow than her quiet smile ever let on. She had spent 3 decades building a life out of the wreckage of one terrible year, raising a daughter on her own, carrying a memory so heavy she had learned to fold it small enough to fit inside her apron pocket, where it had lived, forgotten by everyone but her, for 30 years. When the car pulled up outside, something in her chest went very still. She told herself it was nothing. A trick of the candlelight, a coincidence of posture and shadow. But the man who stepped out moved the way only one man had ever moved in her memory, unhurried, certain, as though the world had long ago agreed to wait for him. Her hands, steady through 3 decades of carrying trays and burdens alike, began, for the first time in years, to shake. It was him. Older. Grayer. Heavier with the weight of decades he wore like armor. But it was him, and no amount of time could have disguised it from a woman who had once memorized every line of that face in the dark. Lorenzo did not look at her twice. To him, she was simply the woman refilling glasses, straightening napkins, moving through his evening the way staff always did, present, competent, invisible. 30 years had rearranged her face the way only grief and time can, and his memory, buried under decades of his own making, offered him nothing. Cecilia approached the table to take their order, and it took every ounce of her composure to keep her voice from betraying her. She recited the specials. She smiled the practiced smile she had perfected over 1,000 difficult nights. And still, beneath the surface, 30 years of longing and loss churned like something alive. One of Lorenzo's companions studied her with the careless cruelty of a man who had never once needed to consider consequences. "Careful, Lorenzo," he said, smirking. "She looks as though she has been serving this table since the restaurant first opened its doors." Laughter rippled around the table. Lorenzo allowed himself a small, indifferent smile, the kind a man gives when he is not truly paying attention. "Let us hope," he said, "that her memory serves better than her knees." The laughter deepened. Cecilia felt heat rise in her face, not from humiliation, but from something far older and far deeper. 30 years of silence rising to the surface all at once, refusing, finally, to be swallowed. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. Instead, with a steadiness that surprised even her, she reached into the pocket of her apron and withdrew something she had carried, unseen, through 3 decades of ordinary days. A photograph, its edges worn soft as cloth, its colors faded by time and handling. She placed it on the table before him without a word. The laughter died. Lorenzo looked down. A hospital room, 30 years gone. A young man, dark-haired and unguarded in a way his face had not been since. A young woman beside him, luminous with exhaustion and joy. Between them, wrapped in a pale blanket, a newborn daughter neither of them yet knew would become a stranger to him. His hand, the same hand that had signed contracts worth fortunes and silenced rooms with a single gesture, began to tremble. He looked up from the photograph to the woman standing before him, and for the first time in 30 years, he truly saw her. "Cecilia," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like something breaking open after a very long silence. Her eyes filled, and she did not try to stop them. The restaurant around them had gone utterly still, the way a room does when it senses, without understanding why, that something irreversible has just occurred. Lorenzo's companions stared, bewildered, caught between the man they thought they knew and the one now standing frozen before a stranger with tears in her eyes. Neither Lorenzo nor Cecilia spoke. There was nothing simple left to say. 30 years of silence do not break with easy words, they break slowly, painfully, the way old wounds do when finally touched again. All either of them could do, in that suspended moment, was stand there, searching each other's faces for everything the years had taken, and everything, impossibly, that still remained. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories like this to life. 30 years earlier, Lorenzo Ferrara had been a different man, younger, hungrier, and hopelessly in love with a flower seller named Cecilia Russo. He had wandered into the market that morning for no reason he could name, and had left carrying a bundle of white roses and a feeling he did not yet have words for, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. Their love did not arrive suddenly. It built the way certain fires do, slow and deliberate, until it was impossible to imagine the world without it. Lorenzo came from a family whose name carried weight in every room it entered, built on loyalty and respect, though not every foundation beneath it could survive daylight. Cecilia was no fool. She understood exactly what world she was stepping into. But beneath the reputation, beneath the danger that trailed him like a second shadow, she saw a man who wanted, more than anything, an ordinary life. A home. A family. A version of peace his world had never offered him. They married quietly, far from the watching eyes of rivals who would have called it weakness. Within a year, Cecilia was carrying their child, and Lorenzo, for the first time in his life, spoke seriously of walking away from everything he had built. A small house by the sea, he told her. A life where their daughter would never have to learn the difference between respect and fear. Cecilia believed him completely. Then their world collapsed. A powerful businessman was murdered in the city, and within days, the evidence pointed, with cruel precision, directly at Lorenzo. Witnesses appeared who claimed to have seen him at the scene. Documents surfaced linking his name to the crime, each one more damning than the last. Lorenzo denied every word of it, but accusation moves faster than truth, and there was little he could do to outrun it. He did not know, not then, that the entire case had been constructed with patience and precision by men who wanted what his family had spent generations building. They had waited years for the right moment to destroy him, and they had chosen it well. Cecilia watched her world narrow to almost nothing. Reporters gathered outside their door. Old friends stopped answering. She held their newborn daughter through sleepless nights, terrified of what would happen to both of them if Lorenzo was found guilty of a crime he had not committed. "We have to leave," she told him one night, her voice trembling in the dark. "Take her somewhere safe. Before it's too late for all of us." Lorenzo refused. "If I run, I confirm every lie they've told about me. I have to stay. I have to fight this." "And if you lose?" Cecilia asked, her voice breaking. "What becomes of her then?" He had no answer. Consumed by rage and the desperate need to clear his name, he grew blind to the quiet devastation happening beside him. His nights disappeared into meetings with lawyers, with old contacts, with anyone who might help him prove his innocence. His days at home grew shorter, then vanished entirely. Cecilia began to feel herself disappearing, invisible even in her own marriage. She loved him still, she never stopped, but fear has a way of making people do things love alone never could. One night, after another argument that left them both hollow, Cecilia made her decision. She packed one small bag for herself and their daughter. On the kitchen table, with a hand that would not stop shaking, she left a letter. "I am not leaving because I stopped loving you. I am leaving because I am afraid of what will happen to her if I stay. Forgive me, if you ever can. When Lorenzo came home that night, the house was silent in a way it had never been before. The letter sat waiting for him, ink smudged where a single tear had fallen across the page. He read it once. Then again. Then a third time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something survivable. He searched. He called in every favor, questioned every contact, turned over every stone he could find. But Cecilia had disappeared completely, taking their daughter into a life he could not follow, determined to give her a childhood untouched by the fear that had swallowed her own. Months later, the case against him quietly collapsed. Witnesses recanted. Evidence unraveled under scrutiny it should have received from the start. The charges were dropped, though in the court of public memory, his name was never fully cleared. By then, it no longer mattered to him. The only thing he had ever truly wanted to protect was already gone, vanished into a life he would spend the next 30 years trying, and failing, to forget. Lorenzo never remarried. His empire grew wider and colder with each passing year, but he never again let anyone close enough to fill the silence Cecilia had left behind. He told himself, in the private hours when the truth could no longer be avoided, that he had let her go for her own good. He never once believed the day would come when he would stand across a restaurant table from her again, 30 years later, staring down at a photograph that had never once left her side. Back inside the restaurant, the silence between them stretched long enough to become its own presence. Lorenzo's companions did not know where to look. One of them, sensing something far beyond his understanding, quietly asked the remaining guests to give the two of them room. Slowly, reluctantly, the small gathering of onlookers returned to their meals, though hushed conversation continued to move through the room like smoke. Lorenzo rose from his chair, his legs unsteady beneath him, as though the floor itself had shifted. He studied Cecilia's face, searching for the young woman he remembered, and finding her there still, beneath 30 years of quiet endurance. "Can we speak?" he asked, his voice low, somewhere private. Cecilia glanced toward the kitchen, where her manager watched with quiet concern. She nodded. "My shift ends in 20 minutes. There is a garden behind the building. Meet me there." Those 20 minutes stretched into something unbearable. Lorenzo sat at the table, untouched food growing cold before him, his mind entirely elsewhere. His friends attempted conversation and received only silence in return. All he could think of was the photograph now folded carefully in his coat pocket, its worn edges, its faded colors, undeniable proof of a life he had long believed was lost to him forever. When Cecilia finally stepped into the garden, the evening sky had deepened into a soft, bruised orange. Lorenzo stood near an old stone bench, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. "I never stopped thinking of you," he said, before she could speak. "Not for a single day in 30 years. Her eyes filled instantly. "Nor I of you," she admitted. "But I was afraid, Lorenzo. Afraid of what your world would do to her if she grew up inside it. I made the only choice I believed I had." "You could have told me," he said, though there was no accusation in his voice, only grief. "We might have found another way." "Would we have?" Cecilia asked. "You were so consumed with proving your innocence that you barely noticed how frightened I had become. I did not leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I loved our daughter more than I feared losing you." Lorenzo lowered his eyes, understanding now, 30 years too late, what he had been too blind to see then. His pride, his need to fight and be proven right, had cost him the only two people who had ever truly mattered. "Where is she now?" he asked quietly. "Our daughter." Cecilia hesitated, her fingers twisting together. "Her name is Alessandra," she said. "She grew up strong. Fierce. She became a detective." Something tightened in Lorenzo's chest. "A detective?" "She has spent years chasing the truth behind a case," Cecilia continued, her voice trembling now. "An old case, involving a man she believes to be dangerous. She does not know who her father is, Lorenzo. I never gave her your name. I was too afraid of what it might mean for her, working so closely with the very institutions that once destroyed us." Lorenzo's mind moved quickly now, pulling threads together he had not yet allowed himself to touch. "What case?" Cecilia's voice dropped to something barely audible. "The murder from 30 years ago. The one that nearly destroyed you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of what this meant settling over them both like a stone sinking slowly through water. Their daughter, without knowing it, had spent years hunting the very man who was her own blood. Lorenzo's hands began to shake, not from any fear of what she might do, but from the ache of everything stolen from him. Birthdays he had never celebrated. First steps he had never witnessed. An entire childhood he knew absolutely nothing about. "I need to see her," he said finally. "I need to know my daughter." Cecilia looked at him, caught between hope and dread. "It will not be simple, Lorenzo. If she learns the truth without warning, I do not know how she will respond. Her entire career has been built on finding justice for what she believes happened to her mother, believing you were the villain in that story." "Then we tell her together," Lorenzo said gently. "Whatever comes next, we face it as one, this time." For the first time in 30 years, Cecilia allowed herself to believe, if only a little, that even the most broken things could still, somehow, be mended. Alessandra Ferrara sat at her desk long after the rest of the department had gone home, surrounded by files and photographs pinned across the wall in front of her like the pieces of a puzzle that had refused, for years, to complete itself. Her mother had always given her the story in fragments, a man who had once caused their family great suffering, a man whose actions had forced them to rebuild their lives from nothing. Alessandra had spent her entire career chasing the truth about him. She was sharp, relentless, known throughout the department for instincts that rarely failed her and a stubbornness that refused to let cases die simply because time had passed. But something about this particular investigation had always felt different, more personal, in a way she had never quite been able to name, even to herself. When her mother called that night, Alessandra heard something unfamiliar in her voice immediately. Cecilia rarely called this late, and never with this particular tremor beneath her words. "Mama, what's wrong?" Alessandra asked, sitting forward, concern sharpening instantly. "I need to tell you something," Cecilia said, her voice unsteady. "I have information about the man you've been searching for. The one from the old case." Alessandra straightened, pulse quickening. "You know something? Why would you keep this from me all this time?" "It is complicated," Cecilia said. "Please. Can we meet? All three of us. Tomorrow evening." "All three of us?" Alessandra repeated, confused. "You, me, and him," Cecilia said quietly. Alessandra's mind raced through possibilities, a confession, perhaps, or a long silent witness finally willing to speak after decades of fear. She agreed at once, her heart pounding with anticipation, certain she was finally closing in on the case that had shaped so much of her adult life. She had no idea how personal the truth was about to become. The following evening, Alessandra arrived at the quiet cafe her mother had chosen, dressed in the sharp, composed manner she wore like armor, a folder of notes tucked beneath her arm. She had prepared for questions, statements, evidence, anything a case like this might demand. She was not prepared for what she found waiting inside. Her mother sat at a corner table, hands folded tightly. Beside her sat an older man, composed and distinguished, though his eyes carried a restless energy Alessandra recognized instantly from years spent reading suspects across interrogation tables. "This is Lorenzo," Cecilia said softly, gesturing toward the man beside her. Alessandra's professional instincts sharpened at once. She had studied photographs of this man before, decades old and faded with time, filed away in evidence boxes she had returned to more times than she could count. She examined his face carefully, matching it against the images burned into her memory. "You're the man from the case," she said slowly, taking a seat across from them. "The one everyone believed committed that murder 30 years ago." "I did not commit that crime," Lorenzo said, his voice calm despite the weight behind it. "I was framed by men who wanted what my family had built." Alessandra opened her folder out of habit, ready to question him the way she had questioned countless suspects before. She asked about dates, about witnesses, about the events leading up to that night 30 years past. Lorenzo answered every question with a steadiness that surprised her, though something behind his eyes betrayed how much the memory still cost him. As the conversation deepened, small details began to surface. Dates that aligned precisely with her own history. Names she recognized from her family's past. A hospital Lorenzo mentioned, almost in passing, describing it as the site of the happiest day of his life, the very hospital where Alessandra herself had been born. Her pen slowed against the page. Something did not sit right, and yet everything felt unsettlingly familiar. "Show her the photograph," Cecilia said quietly, turning toward Lorenzo. He reached into his coat and placed the old, worn photograph on the table, the same one Cecilia had carried, folded small, for 30 years. Alessandra stared down at the image. A young man. A young woman. A newborn cradled between them in a hospital room decades gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized the woman instantly, her mother, decades younger, radiant with exhaustion and joy. And in the man's arms lay a sleeping infant, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, a small birthmark visible on her tiny wrist, the same birthmark Alessandra had carried, unremarkable and unexplained, her entire life. She looked up slowly from the photograph to Lorenzo's face, her mind refusing what her heart had already understood. "No," she whispered. "This isn't possible." But somewhere beneath the disbelief, she already knew it was true. The cafe around them seemed to fold into silence. Alessandra sat frozen, the photograph trembling faintly in her hands. Every fact she had ever gathered, every piece of evidence she had studied 100 times over, now carried a new and unbearable weight. "You're my father," she said slowly, testing the words as though they belonged to a stranger's life rather than her own. Lorenzo nodded, his eyes carrying a sorrow he had kept buried for 30 years. "I did not know you existed until tonight, when your mother told me. I searched for both of you after she left. I never found you. I have spent 30 years wondering what became of the family I lost." Something inside Alessandra broke open, anger and confusion tangled with a tenderness she did not yet have the words for. She turned to her mother, her voice sharpening. "You knew. All this time, while I was building an entire case against this man, believing him a villain, you knew he was my father." "I did not know at first," Cecilia said, her composure cracking. "I only learned of your investigation recently. I was afraid, Alessandra. Afraid of how this truth would change you. Afraid of what it might do to your career. Afraid, most of all, of hurting you the way I once hurt him. You should have told me, Alessandra said, rising abruptly, her chair scraping hard against the floor. I have given years of my life to this case. I built my entire career trying to bring justice for what I believed this man did to our family. And this whole time, he was the family I never knew existed. She needed air. She needed distance. Without another word, she turned and walked out into the night, leaving her parents behind in stunned, aching silence. Cecilia reached instinctively for Lorenzo's hand, then hesitated, uncertain whether such closeness still belonged to her. She needs time, she said softly. This is too much to accept all at once. Lorenzo nodded, though the ache in his chest felt unbearable. He had waited 30 years to meet his daughter, only to watch her disappear within minutes of learning the truth. In the days that followed, Alessandra threw herself back into work, though her thoughts refused to settle. She pulled every file connected to the old case, reading statements she had reviewed dozens of times before, but now with new eyes, searching not only for the truth of the crime, but for the truth of her father's innocence. The deeper she looked, the more the old case began to unravel. Witnesses whose statements contradicted one another. A crucial piece of evidence that had surfaced days after the murder with no clear explanation of its origin. Signatures on official documents that did not match records from earlier that same year. Someone had built this case with careful, deliberate precision against Lorenzo. Alessandra worked late into the night, driven now by something far deeper than professional duty. This was no longer about justice for a stranger. This was about her family. About a father she had never known, and 30 years that could never be returned to any of them. She reached out to retired officers who had worked the original investigation, some reluctant to revisit the past, others surprised anyone still cared after so many years had passed. Slowly, methodically, a picture began to emerge, one entirely different from the story she had built her career around. One name kept surfacing in the margins of old records, a man who had once worked closely with the murdered businessman, a man who had quietly absorbed much of his fortune once the case against Lorenzo collapsed. His name was Emilio Barone. Alessandra stared at the name for a long moment, her heart pounding with the growing certainty that she was finally close to uncovering the true story behind the crime that had quietly shaped every year of her life. She picked up her phone and called her mother. I need to see him again, she said quietly. I need to speak with my father. Lorenzo agreed to meet her the following afternoon, alone this time, just the two of them. He arrived early at the small park she had chosen, a quiet stretch of tall trees overlooking the river, and sat on a worn bench, watching the water move slowly by while uncertainty churned inside him over what she might say. When Alessandra arrived, she carried a thick folder of documents, though her expression had softened considerably since the night before. She sat beside him in silence for a long moment before finally speaking. I have been going through the old case, she said. All of it. And I believe you were telling the truth. You were framed. Lorenzo turned to her, studying her face carefully. You believe me. The evidence does not hold together, Alessandra said. There is a man named Emilio Barone. He worked closely with the businessman who was murdered. After the case against you collapsed and your name was dragged through scandal, he quietly absorbed nearly all of that man's business. I believe he engineered the entire frame, using the chaos to eliminate a rival and claim everything for himself. Lorenzo felt relief and anger settle over him in equal, disorienting measure. For 30 years he had lived beneath the shadow of an accusation he could never fully escape, even after the charges themselves had quietly dissolved. To hear the truth spoken aloud, confirmed through his own daughter's careful, relentless work, brought a release he had not expected to feel. I want to help you clear your name properly, Alessandra continued. Not the quiet dismissal it received decades ago, but a real, public acknowledgement of the truth. You deserve that. Our family deserves that. Lorenzo's eyes filled with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. Thank you, he said quietly. But Alessandra, I do not need this for my own sake. I have carried that shadow so long, I made my peace with it years ago. What I want, more than any cleared name, is the chance to know you. To be part of your life now, even after everything that was lost between us. Alessandra looked down at the folder in her lap, then back at him. I spent years believing you were the reason my family suffered, she admitted quietly. It is strange, discovering the truth is so different from the story I built my entire career around. Your mother did what she believed was right, Lorenzo said gently. She protected you the only way she knew how, in a world that gave her very few good options. I do not blame her. Not anymore. I understand now how frightened she must have been. Over the following weeks, Alessandra worked methodically to expose Emilio Barone's role in the old crime, building a case as thorough as any she had assembled in her career, driven by a determination that came from somewhere far deeper than duty. When the truth finally surfaced publicly, it moved quickly through the city. Lorenzo Ferrara, long whispered about in connection with a decades-old murder, was formally and publicly cleared. Emilio Barone was arrested, his years of quiet manipulation finally, irreversibly exposed. For the first time in 30 years, Lorenzo walked through the city without the weight of suspicion trailing behind him. Slowly, carefully, something began to grow between father and daughter. Alessandra visited often, listening to stories of the young man Lorenzo had once been, learning pieces of a family history she had never known existed. Lorenzo, in turn, listened eagerly to every detail of the life he had missed, her childhood, her choices, the woman she had quietly become without him. But even as father and daughter drew closer, something remained unresolved between Lorenzo and Cecilia. They spoke often now, sharing quiet dinners and long walks through the old quarter, yet neither dared to voice the words that lingered beneath every conversation. 30 years of distance had built walls between them that neither seemed ready to fully dismantle. Then one afternoon, Cecilia sat Alessandra down and told her she had accepted a position in another city, a fresh beginning offered to her months earlier, long before Lorenzo had re-entered her life. "I think it is time," Cecilia said softly. "Too much has happened here. I need something new." Alessandra studied her mother's face carefully. "And Lorenzo? What becomes of him?" Cecilia's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Some things, Alessandra, cannot be recovered, no matter how much we might wish they could." Alessandra said nothing in response. But deep inside, she was far from certain her mother was right. The morning of Cecilia's departure arrived too quickly. She stood in the airport with a single suitcase beside her, watching the crowds move past, travelers rushing toward destinations of their own, new beginnings that seemed to belong to everyone but her. She had told herself this was the right decision. A fresh start, far from memories that still ached every time she passed the old restaurant, every time she saw Lorenzo's name mentioned in the news, cleared now of the shadow that had followed him for 30 years. Alessandra had come to say goodbye, though her eyes kept drifting toward the entrance, as though she were waiting for something more. "You don't have to go," Alessandra said softly. "You know that." Cecilia offered a gentle, sorrowful smile. "I have spent 30 years running from the things I was too afraid to face. This time, I am simply choosing something new for myself. That is different." "Is it?" Alessandra asked quietly. Before Cecilia could answer, a voice came from behind her, one she would have known anywhere, even after 30 years of silence. "Cecilia." She turned slowly, her heart catching hard in her chest. Lorenzo stood a few steps away, dressed simply, a single suitcase of his own in his hand. His eyes were steady, though his fingers trembled slightly around the handle. "What are you doing here?" Cecilia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 30 years ago, I let you walk away," Lorenzo said. "I was too consumed by pride, too determined to prove myself right, to see everything I was losing in the process. I promised myself, if I were ever given another chance, I would not make that same mistake twice." Tears filled Cecilia's eyes. "Lorenzo, we are not young anymore. Too much time has passed between us. We cannot simply begin again as though none of it happened." "You're right," Lorenzo said, stepping closer. "We are not young. We carry scars now, and regrets, and years neither of us will ever get back. But we are still here. Still standing. And I would rather spend whatever years remain trying to build something with you, than spend even one more day pretending I no longer love you." Cecilia's breath caught. "I am leaving, Lorenzo. My flight boards within the hour." Lorenzo lifted his suitcase slightly, a small, hopeful smile crossing his face. "Then let's stop wasting time. If you're leaving, I'm coming with you." Cecilia searched his face for any trace of doubt and found none. 30 years of longing, of unanswered questions, of nights spent wondering what might have been, rose up inside her all at once, refusing any longer to be silenced. "You would leave everything behind?" she asked. "Your business. Your home. Everything you built here." "I already lost the only thing that ever truly mattered," Lorenzo said quietly. "I will not make that mistake a second time. Wherever you go, Cecilia, that is where I intend to be." Alessandra watched from a few steps away, tears sliding freely down her own face as she witnessed 30 years of pain slowly beginning to heal in front of her. Cecilia closed the distance between them and pressed her palm gently against his chest, feeling his heart beating steadily beneath her hand, as though it had simply been waiting, all this time, for her to return to it. "Then you had better buy a ticket," she said, a soft laugh breaking through her tears. Lorenzo laughed as well, a deep, unguarded sound Alessandra realized she had never once heard from him before, full of a relief and joy long buried beneath years of solitude. Alessandra stepped closer, wiping her eyes, and Cecilia reached out, drawing her daughter into the embrace as well. For the first time, the three of them stood together, not as strangers connected by a painful past, but as a family finally given a second chance. They did not know exactly what the future would hold. There would be difficult conversations still to come, adjustments, and slow, uncertain lessons in how to become a family after 30 years apart. But standing together in the crowded airport, none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was that they had finally chosen each other, after decades spent choosing fear instead. Lorenzo purchased a ticket for the same flight, and the three of them walked toward the gate together, side by side, ready to begin a chapter neither Lorenzo nor Cecilia had ever truly believed they would live to write. Sometimes love does not disappear, even after 30 years of silence. Sometimes it simply waits, patiently, for the right moment to bloom again. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. We would love to know which part moved you the most. Stay tuned for more heartfelt stories of mature love, second chances, and family, coming very soon.